It was Saturday, October 29th. Father Simon, Sebastian, and I have been invited to a party on that Halloween weekend. And so we found ourselves stepping from the lobby into an elevator in the apartment building complex. There was an elderly gentleman standing inside, probably about Father Simon's age. And the man asked, "Floor 19?" To which Father Simon responded, "How did you know?" He said, "Well, I let some others into the building a bit earlier. It sounds like there's a party or something going on up there." Then he looked at me. Then he looked at Father Simon. And then he looked down at the bottle of wine in Father Simon's left hand. And then he looked back up at Father Simon and then back at me and said, "Oh, must be a costume party." And then I said, "No, man, we're the real deal." And he said, "No." Just like that. I said, "Yeah, we're real priests." And then he got off the elevator real quick. Now tonight I'd like to offer for our meditation and reflection some thoughts on the nature of the priesthood and the nature of the Eucharist. Now that may seem a bit self-indulgent, but it's customary on this night to speak of the priesthood. And so it's the one night of the year I get to do so, and so I will. Now, as a young man, when I was discerning a call to the priesthood, I really wrestled with this question, night and day. And I remember one particular day, as I was wrestling, I felt so convicted that I was clinging to my own plans, my own desires, that I felt like I just had to surrender my whole life to God. And so in a moment of desperation, I fell on my knees and I cried out to God. I said, "God, I will do whatever you want me to do." And then something unexpected happened. A few more additional words escaped from my lips that I hadn't intended to say. I said, "God, I will do whatever you want me to do, even if that means becoming a priest." And I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but you have one of those moments where everything goes slow motion, right? And it was like I could see those words coming out of my mouth, and I was like, "No!" And I was trying to grasp them, but it was too late. It had just slipped out, and I'd given God permission to make me even a priest. Now, after the words, I said, "You know what? Fine, God. If you really want, I'll become a priest, and I'll just be miserable for the rest of my life." Right? So melodramatic. Now look at me. Miserable. Right? I'm just kidding. Now, to my surprise, becoming a priest, and I did in fact say that to God, but becoming a priest was the best decision I ever made. And there's not a day that goes by where I don't fall on my knees and thank God for the gift that He's given me. Now, to become a priest today is challenging, right? You look into the world and the culture in which we live, you look at the church, and there are all kinds of challenges that face the church and face the priesthood. We see a decline in religious practice across the Western world. We're faced with often incompetent church leadership, the poor witness of priests and their moral failings that are on display for the world to see, whether it's the clergy abuse crisis, which rears its ugly head every so often, the residential schools, and the consequent decline in vocations that we see fewer and fewer young men responding to a call to be a priest today. And yet, for all the ugliness that we see, that often obscures the priesthood. It is, in fact, one of the greatest gifts that God can give. St. John Vianney once remarked that the priesthood is the love of the heart of Jesus. And so what is the priesthood? Well, I don't feel like I can explain what the priesthood is without explaining a little bit about the Eucharist, the other sacrament which was instituted on this night almost 2,000 years ago in that upper room when Jesus brought together his 12 closest and most intimate friends, the apostles. On that night in the upper room, Jesus instituted the sacrament of the Eucharist. Now, what is the Eucharist but a sacrifice? The sacrifice of the whole life, death, resurrection of Jesus, what we call the Paschal mystery. Now, Jesus offers the sacrifice of the Eucharist in that upper room. He says these words, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body." And then he says, "Take this, all of you, and drink of it, for this is the chalice of my blood." Now, the Council of Trent, a gathering of priests and bishops around 1500, declared or proclaimed that the body and in the Eucharist are the body and blood, soul and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ, and therefore the whole Christ is truly, really, and substantially present. Now, in every sacrifice, two things are necessary: the offering and the offerer, the gift and the giver, the victim and the priest. A priest, therefore, is the one who offers the gift to God. Now, one of the things that makes Jesus singularly unique in the whole history of religious sacrifice is that in himself he is both the victim and the priest. He is both the offerer and the offering. He is the perfect sacrifice and the perfect priest who offers himself. Now, on this most sacred of nights, after Jesus utters those words, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body," and "Take this, all of you, and drink for it, for this is the chalice of my blood," he then institutes the Eucharist as a perpetual act at the heart of the life of the church when he turns to his 12 disciples and commands them to do this in memory of me. And so the church, heeding the command of her master, has done that for 2,000 years in churches all around the world. And it is the center of all that we do in our life of worship as a church. It is what brings us back week after week, month after month, year after year, to gather together around the sacrifice of the Eucharist, in which Jesus offers the gift of his very self, truly, truly present, substantially. This incredible gift, the pulsating heart of Jesus, which grants life to the whole church, to each and every one of us. Now, if we believe that what is offered in the Mass is, in fact, truly the sacrament of Christ himself, who can offer such a sacrifice? Who can offer the sacrifice of Christ except Christ himself? Since Christ is the victim, he must also be the priest. And thus the sacrament of the offering, Christ himself, is joined with the sacrament of the offerer, Christ himself, such that what is offered and the one who offers are one and the same. Both are Christ, the sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrament of the priesthood. The sacrament of the Eucharist and the sacrament of the priesthood are two sides of the same coin, and the coin is Christ. Now, those words of sacred institution that every priest utters over the elements of bread and wine, this is my body and this is my blood, are only true and only can be true if they are uttered by Christ himself through the lips of the priest. Because if they are only my words, then I utter this over something that is not my body. And so it is that we have the real reason Jesus gives us the priesthood. Jesus gives us priests so that priests can give us Jesus. St. Pio of Pietrelcina said, "It is easier for the whole earth to exist without the Son than without the holy sacrifice of the Mass." Why? Well, because the sacrifice of the Mass is Jesus, the sacrifice of the salvation of the world, which makes all things new and recreates the heavens and the earth. It is the fulcrum, the axis of the very cosmos around which all things, all creation rotates. Jesus, who gave himself. Now, for some mysterious reason only known to God, he calls the unworthy. He calls sinners. He calls the broken. I mean, just look at me. Those of you who know me know what I say is true. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you've had those conversations with God where you turn to him to tell him all the reasons why you can't do something that he's asking you to do, right? You go through the list of disqualifying yourself. It's conversations that I have often. But I remember wrestling with this question of being called to the priesthood and feeling all kinds of weird, crazy emotions and thoughts about how I'm unworthy and how I'm a sinner. And at the end of it, one of the things I said was, "Lord, I can't be a priest. I'm too good looking to be a priest." And it's embarrassing because it's true. I really said that. But this vain young man, who in love with himself, selfish and foolish and stupid. I mean, some things never change. I'm still too good looking to be a priest. No, I'm kidding. But I tell you what, I'm every bit as broken as that day I said yes. I'm every bit the sinner, selfish, riddled with doubt, proud, impatient, unkind, uncharitable, rude, mean, all of it. All of the sins you can think about, I've done them at one point or another. And believe me when I say that, there's not a day goes by where I even entertain the merest faintest possibility that I might be worthy of the gift that has been given to me. And I've never met a priest who felt any differently. The priests that I live with, none of them feel worthy. And none of them are worthy, for that matter. But this is one of the great mysteries of God's providence. That he uses broken instruments to accomplish his will. And it reminds me, in fact, of a story told by Catherine Doherty, a Catholic writer, social activist, about a time when she was a little child walking through her village. And as she walked down the village road, she saw by the side of the road a gutter in which lay a priest, passed out in a drunken stupor. Now, little Catherine Doherty, she ran home to tell her mom about such obscene a sight. And her mother asked Catherine to take her to the priest who was drunk and asleep. And so she took the man and brought her home to his house, or her house, and she washed him up and put him to bed so he could rest and sober up. And afterwards, her mother said, "Catherine, go fetch your brother's chamber pot and bring it here," which she did. Then she said, "Catherine, go into the garden and pick the purest white lily you can find," which she did. She went back into the house and handed that purest white lily to her mother, who in the meantime had filled her brother's chamber pot with water. The mother took that purest white lily and put it in the chamber pot and treated it like a vase. Now, her mother was teaching Catherine a lesson. And the lesson that was deeply impressed upon Catherine was this, that the humanity of the priest is the gutter. But Christ remains the purest of lilies in his priesthood. See, every priest is a kind of chamber pot, unworthy, a sinner, never, ever worthy of the gift that is given. And we might ask ourselves, why did Jesus choose us? And honestly, I don't know. I've asked him that question many times. And all I know is that he did. And that he even saw all the horrible things I would ever do, and he still called me anyway. And so it is for all of us who have been called by God and chosen in our own particular way, all of us who struggle with the limitations of our own humanity, our own brokenness, who are reminded often of the failures of our past or present, who fall time and time again often into similar patterns of behavior, that we realize in ourselves that we are unworthy, and yet God chooses to love us anyway. That in the midst of a broken church, which is often on the news for horrible things, that in the midst, in the middle, in the center of the life of the church is this incredible gift of the heart of Jesus offered to us in the Eucharist. And that gift doesn't depend on the holiness of the priest who offers the sacrifice. That it's given through his hands, the hands of sometimes unworthy and sinful priests, the unworthiest and most sinful of priests. Jesus still makes himself present so long as he utters those words of institution. The priesthood itself is a symbol that in the midst of a sinful humanity, Jesus is always present and will never abandon us, will never forsake us. Because even though we, at times, are unfaithful, Jesus is always faithful. And so on this night, this most sacred of nights, in which Jesus gives us these twin sacraments, the priesthood and the Eucharist, these unfailing revelations of his fidelity and mercy in the midst of sinful humanity, we come and lay ourselves before the altar, Father Simon and I, but indeed all of us who have been called to share in this great and glorious sacrament, which unfolds in our midst. And so we come not as passive observers, but as intimate actors in the great drama of salvation, which unfolds on the altar this night as Christ, the high priest and victim, offers himself for each and every one of us, totally and completely, who offers everything. And so, what shall we offer in return to him who has offered everything for us?